Welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have over 125 episodes recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss out because of load shedding, or if your Tuesday nights have become busy, never fear, you can always catch up later. So tonight we will be hearing about the fascinating and cutthroat world of brood parasitism, particularly the African cuckoo. But before we get into that, please remember that you can use the Zoom chat and Q&A feeds or the Facebook comment feed to communicate with us, and we will answer questions at the end of the webinar. And of course, we are on all the major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show. We aim to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the series and are able to contribute, no matter how small an amount, please visit the Quicket page or EFT BirdLife South Africa Direct and use the reference webinars and your name. And we so appreciate all of you who support us during these challenging times. And now, seeing all those beautiful Cape Parrot images on the slide, we do want to remind you that we have some amazing Bird of the Year merchandise on sale in the shop for the birds, including pin badges, t-shirts, fluffies, and more. So be sure to buy yours via the BirdLife South Africa online store. And now our major event coming up is Flock to the Wilderness, and it promises to be an incredible event full of exciting birding excursions, top speakers, and a showcase in quality ornithological research, as well as a gathering of passionate bird enthusiasts. The event will take place at the Wilderness Hotel from the 24th to the 28th of May, 2023, and bookings are now open via the BirdLife South Africa website. A highlight of the program is world-renowned photographer Richard Flack, who will be presenting a Canon photography workshop on the 28th of May. With only 50 places available, this promises to be an extremely interesting workshop for any photography enthusiasts, and Richard will share his insights and philosophy on how to capture incredible shots that tell a story. Spots are limited, so be sure to book yours soon. BirdLife South Africa's AGM will also take place on the Saturday with a lunch and afternoon meeting. Please visit our website to find out more. Now, BirdLife South Africa and Outland Escape Tours have joined forces to organize the 2023 Hiking and Biking for Birds Adventure Series, with 6 events happening at 6 different locations throughout the year. The money raised from these events will support the empowering people and regional conservation programs. The events will alternate between hiking or biking and are not aimed at being strenuous, but rather an enjoyable way to find the special birds in each of these regions. We have also launched for the first time a BirdLife South Africa photography competition in partnership with Canon South Africa. There are some really phenomenal prizes up for grabs in a variety of categories, so be sure to check out the website and get your entries ready. And the last advert for the evening, BirdLife South Africa and Eco Training have opened up the weekend of the 19th to the 21st of May. For another of our ever popular birding weekends in the magical Pafuri region of Kruger National Park. Join us for some of the best birds in South Africa, with specials like the racket-tailed roller, Hell's fishing owl, Bohm's spine-tail, and 3-banded courses. The rates are just over 6,000 Rand per person sharing for all 3 nights, all inclusive, and you will never find better value in this sought-after destination. You can email projects@ecotraining.co.za for more information or to book your place. The weekend is limited to 20 people, so don't delay. As an added incentive, a portion of each booking comes to BirdLife South Africa to fund our work, and we look forward to hosting you there. Now on to tonight's main event. Mairenn is a behavioural ecologist and evolutionary biologist undertaking a PhD at the University of Cambridge. The current focus is on the co-evolutionary arms race between avian hosts and brood parasites, particularly cuckoos, and their fork-tailed Drongo hosts. which she studies in Zambia. She is supervised by Professor Claire Attwood, and Mairenn joined Claire's research group in 2019. This followed a degree in natural sciences, also at Cambridge, and time spent leading content at the education charity Climate Science. Prior to her current research, Mairenn has studied a range of taxa, including parasitic plants, Tungara frogs, pollen beetles, butterflies, sea anemones, and stickleback fish. Across these diverse taxa, interaction between individuals and species emerged as a central research. So we're very happy to have you joining us tonight. Mairenn, thanks very much. And we very much look forward to the fascinating story that you'll be telling us about cuckoos and Drongos. So you can start sharing your slides, and you can take it away from there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Christina. And yeah, huge thank you to BirdLife South Africa for hosting the webinars. Can everyone see my screen then? Is that working?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for that introduction. So, as Christina just mentioned, I am going to talk this evening about brood parasitism and the evolutionary battle that's going on between African cuckoos and fork-tailed Drongos. And many of you will be familiar with brood parasitism, but just really briefly, it's this way in which the parasite lays its eggs in the nest of another bird, and we call that bird the host species. And so it's the host that has to take on all the costs of parenting. So from incubating the eggs, building the nest, to feeding the chick and raising it as if it's their own. And specifically, I'm going to focus on the fork-tailed Drongos as hosts. Again, a bird that many of you will be very familiar with, known for their very aggressive displays. They'll often do kind of very extreme mobbing of different species. And they breed across sub-Saharan Africa. They're very widespread and have these open cup nests, which they often build out at the end of long branches, often really high up in different trees. And that's the host in this particular brood parasitism interaction that I'm really interested in. And the parasite in this case is the African cuckoo. Again, you might recognize their call. They're intra-African migrants. And it was actually, their kind of movements have been studied quite well from Nigeria, where they breed and then migrate southeast into Cameroon and the Central African Republic and then back. But their movements kind of in the southern half of Africa are less well understood. But they certainly breed in kind of central southern Africa and arrive with the rains usually in different locations. And that's when you'll hear their call. They're brood parasites, so that means they're laying their eggs in fork-tailed Drongo nests. And they're also specialist parasites. That's a bit rarer. That means fork-tailed Drongos are pretty much the main, possibly only host of the African cuckoo. Lots of other brood parasitic species will lay their eggs in a nest of multiple different hosts. So instead of just picking one species, they'll have multiple that they're able to parasitize. But the African cuckoo focuses just on fork-tailed Drongos. There's a couple of possible records of African cuckoos parasitizing yellow-billed shrike, again, kind of in West Africa, but not many of those records. So it's not clear if that's a common host or just something that the African cuckoo does occasionally. Okay. So, having looked at the main players in this process, what's going on across brood parasitism? And throughout the talk today, we're actually going to follow parasitism from a bird's eye point of view. And that means we start by choosing a host. So a parasite has to decide, firstly, at an evolutionary level, which species it's going to parasitize. But then also on a day-to-day basis, a parasite has to decide exactly which nest it's going to parasitize and lay its eggs in the nest of. And the image here is actually what that choice might look like to an African cuckoo at our field site in Zambia, where my research group studies these birds. And each of those little blue points is a GPS location of a Drongo nest. And so we mark all these nests. DA stands for Dicrurus adsimilis, and then we have a code for the number of the nest. And so as an African cuckoo, maybe in this range, those are all the different possible nests in which you could lay an egg. But how do you actually decide which to go for? Once you've chosen a host, a parasite has to get around the host's frontline defences. So these are the defences that a host uses to stop the parasite from laying their egg in its nest at all. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail further on. The parasite often actually has counter adaptations to these frontline defences. So they have ways of protecting themselves or attacking and counter-attacking in order to be able to lay their egg in the host's nest. If it's successful and it does manage to lay its egg, it's not too late for the host. There's still egg stage defences that mean they can still protect their nest and clutch potentially, because it's only once the parasite egg has hatched that the African cuckoo chick will kill all of the drongo eggs and chicks in the nest. And the way the African cuckoo chick does this is very similar to the common cuckoo. It essentially pushes all the other eggs and chicks out of the nest. And it has a kind of flat back that enables it to do that immediately after hatching while it's still blind and featherless. And it's quite incredible, really. But it's not too late for the host to stop it from doing that if it can stop the parasite at the egg stage. Once the eggs hatch, though, it's too late. The host ends up feeding the parasite chick, and that means the drongos looking after it until the cuckoo's able to fledge from the nest. And actually, interestingly, we find that drongos tend to feed African cuckoos for longer than they would even feed their own chicks. So they'll, from hatching to fledging, a drongo chick takes maybe 17 to 18 days, but a cuckoo chick will be much longer in the nest, probably more like 23, 24 sort of time. So it's getting that care for even longer than a drongo would. So to study this whole process, we're going to take you to the battlefield for this evolutionary battle between the drongo and the cuckoo. And it actually occurs across the African cuckoo's breeding range. So in this range map for the African cuckoo on the left, you can see the breeding range in orange and then year round in purple. And specifically, my research group works in the southern province of Zambia, in Choma, marked by this little red dot, and in the beautiful Miombo woodlands there. And I'd just like now to mention all the amazing team of people that make research in this place possible. So that's led by Professor Claire Spottiswoode at University of Cape Town and Cambridge, and then a brilliant field team and research team, including Collins, Jess, Shima, Tanmay, Gabriel, Silky and Cameron. And we also work with a whole team of nest finders in that area, and that's how it's possible to study this dynamic between the drongos and cuckoos. So it's a big team effort to get at the evolutionary puzzles going on here. Okay, let's start at the beginning. How are parasites choosing their hosts? How should parasites choose their hosts? And actually, I'm going to zoom out for a second here. So we have just been talking about brood parasites, but to understand how brood parasites choose their host, it's actually helpful to think about parasitism more in general. And parasitism comes down to stealing energy from another species. So in brood parasitism, you're stealing the energy of parental care. The parasite stealing the host's ability and energy that they spend feeding and incubating and building nests. But in other types of parasitism, different types of energy can be stolen. So for example, you have parasites like louse flies and ticks, and they might live on a bird's skin and suck blood. So they're stealing energy directly by stealing the blood resource from those birds. Or you might have kleptoparasites. That's a different kind of parasite again, such as gulls and terns, which are stealing food from other species like pelicans. So in kleptoparasitism, again, energy is being stolen, but it's from foraging energy that birds have spent to forage their own food. And kleptoparasitism, klepto meaning stealing, means that food items are literally stolen by one bird, the kleptoparasite, from the bird that's foraged that food item. And across all these different kinds of parasitism, so from infections and ectoparasites, so those blood-sucking parasites, through to brood parasites and kleptoparasites, there's a dilemma for the parasite. You can either choose a high-quality host. Here's the ectoparasite for an alpine swift, and here was the kleptoparasite. So these were the gulls and the pelicans. But as I was saying, a parasite can either choose a high quality host or a host which is easy to parasitize. And it tends to be that these two things are kind of opposites. You don't tend to be able to have a high quality host which is also very easy to parasitize. It's an either or, because hosts which are really high quality, so have a really good resource or lots of energy to steal, tend to be the ones that have really good defenses, and that makes them difficult to parasitize. And actually, these two examples that I've just got up in the images show that across those types of parasitism. So in the louse fly, they suck the blood of these alpine swifts, and they can either choose high quality swifts, which means that they get a big blood meal and they grow more quickly as parasites. But those swifts that offer a bigger blood meal have much stronger immune defenses. So it makes it really hard for the lousefly to be able to parasitize those birds. A similar dilemma is found for a kleptoparasite. So this image on the right, and there it's to do with age. So a kleptoparasite can either choose to steal food from an older bird, which tends to forage really high quality food items. It finds bigger fish. But those older birds tend to be much harder to steal the food from because they're more experienced and can maneuver and fly more easily to avoid this kleptoparasitic stealing. Or they've got the opposite option, which is steal from a juvenile, and that might be more like taking candy from a baby, literally more easy. But also those juveniles tend to forage smaller food items. So the quality of that bird is less, and the parasite's getting less out of it. So depending on the parasite, it might be worth going for one or the other. And this kind of dilemma that parasites face is really interesting in general, because global change could affect parasite choice in ways that we're just starting to understand. So from a conservation point of view, we might want to know more about how parasites choose their hosts, because things like food availability, temperature, and pollution can all affect how much quality a host has and how strong their defenses are. So if what we're seeing is greater stress, either through increased temperatures or pollution or lower food availability, that will often make hosts have lower quality. So they might be weaker, but also mean that they then have weaker defenses. And to look across an ecosystem, we want to know how that's going to affect all these different animal interactions. Does that mean the parasites is going to start to do better as we see these kind of changes because they can overcome defenses more easily as defenses get weaker? Or does it actually mean because parasites are not getting as much energy because that other side, the quality is also decreasing, that we're seeing different interactions happening? So that's the big picture. But hang on, I was meant to be talking about brood parasites, and I've just talked about not brood parasites for a little bit. Does it apply to brood parasites too? Well, the answer seems to be yes. Choosing between quality and defenses when choosing a host does really seem to matter for different brood parasites. Defenses certainly do. So because lots of hosts have ways to prevent parasites from laying their eggs in that host nest, the strength of a host defense really makes a difference to whether a parasite's going to be able to lay its egg in a nest. And quality also seems to matter a lot. And that's because higher quality hosts are able to give much better parenting to the parasite's young. So even though it might be much more difficult for a parasite to lay its egg in a high quality host with good defenses, if those defenses also work against predators, and mean that that host is a much better parent. It's worth it for the parasite if it then has much higher survival for its own offspring later on. And we see this in a couple of different ways, potentially. One is with cooperative breeders. So again, you might be familiar with arrow-marked babblers being parasitized by Leviant's cuckoo. And you might also know about arrow-marked babblers being cooperative breeders. So that's just where multiple birds in a group help to raise the chicks. And cooperative breeding links this defences and quality just by sheer number. So larger groups of cooperative breeders, where there's more helpers at the nests, are better at defending their nests because there's more eyes to look out for cuckoos and because they can all help drive cuckoos away. But even though it makes it more challenging for the cuckoo, if a cuckoo is successful, those larger groups of helpers mean there can be more food provisioning or better predator defense, which means the cuckoo then may be more likely to survive through to fledging as a chick if it's laid in that nest as an egg. So cooperative breeding means that for sure in those examples we see this link between quality and defences in those hosts of brood parasites. There's another kind of brood parasite which follows a really similar trend, but fascinatingly it's a very different kind of brood parasite. That's actually the cuckoo bumblebee. So brood parasitism doesn't only happen in birds. There are also insects and fish which have evolved this way of living. And cuckoo bumblebees infiltrate other bumblebee nests in order to lay their brood. And then those other bumblebees will just raise the cuckoo bumblebees' offspring instead. And when cuckoo bumblebees choose these nests, they face the same choice that a Leviant's cuckoo does of what number of individuals in the colony, what number of hosts do they go for. If they pick a colony of bumblebees that has loads of bumblebee workers, then they face a really high chance of being killed as they try and get into that nest. But if they're successful, those high number of workers means many, many cuckoo bumblebee offspring will be raised successfully. Whereas if they chose a much smaller colony to try and parasitize, they'd be much more easy for them to get in and to avoid being killed while they're laying their eggs. But then their offspring might not survive. So they might lay all those eggs, but there's not enough workers to raise them. So we see this kind of thing across different kinds of parasitism. But how does this link specifically now to fork-tailed drongos and African cuckoos? Well, that all comes down to frontline defences, this next stage of parasitism. So frontline defences, as I mentioned at the start, is any way that a nest is being defended before the egg is even laid by the parasite. That's why it's the front line, the first line of defence. And cooperative breeding is one of those frontline defences, or could be, because if you have multiple helpers, it might be harder for a parasite to slip in unnoticed and lay its egg. Nesting aggregations where you have multiple species nesting in the same place could also work in the same way. You've got more eyes or more vigilance to spot the parasite. Nesting placement and architecture, so the way nests are built and whether they're hidden or not, can also act as a frontline defence. So nests which are more hidden might be harder for a parasite to locate, and therefore the cuckoo finds it harder to lay its egg just because it can't find the nest in the first place. And then, crucially, aggression. This also acts as a frontline defence because mobbing of species just directly can repel a cuckoo if it's being beaten up. And I think you'd all agree that as far as aggression and mobbing goes, fork-tailed drongos are up there. And perhaps if you were thinking about parasitizing this drongo, you'd think again. Warwick Tarverton actually suggested that cuckoos might suffer from drongo aggression when they're trying to lay their eggs, but then also benefit when their chicks are growing up, particularly because this aggression by drongos can also work against predators later on. So if they're able to drive away snakes and other predators and raise the cuckoo chick successfully, that could benefit the African cuckoo. Exactly what this aggression looks like, I can give you a little insight into just now. I'm going to make sure my sound's being shared for this next video. So hopefully there you could see and hear directly that very aggressive front line of defence. That's actually a cuckoo model, a little bit more on those later, near a drongo nest at the field site in Choma. And you could see both of the drongos in that pair very aggressively mobbing the cuckoo, dive bombing it. You could hear their alarming. And this seems to be a pretty effective frontline defence. However, as I mentioned again at the start, parasites and cuckoos have these counter adaptations. And one of them, which we have kind of understood really well in a slightly different system, is hawk mimicry. So you might see in these two pictures a lot of similarities here visually between the African cuckoo and, say, a little sparrowhawk. You've got the yellow of the eye, you've got the barring on the front, so this kind of white front with the black barring in the plumage, yellow feet, there's certain barring on the tails and the kind of grey plumage. There's really quite striking similarities. And these similarities have also been noticed for the common cuckoo and studied in that context actually in Europe. And work by researchers Wellbergen and Davis found that in the common cuckoo, looking like a hawk deters mobbing from the hosts. So hosts of the common cuckoo, reed warblers, would typically benefit from attacking the cuckoos and driving them away from the nest. But because they think that the common cuckoo is a hawk, they're afraid to mob as much as would be beneficial for them to do. And so the question is, does this counter adaptation, this hawk mimicry, work against drongos? Does looking like a hawk prevent the drongos from being as aggressive to African cuckoos as they would otherwise be? And the way to answer that question was by presenting different models to drongos. So the setup in kind of diagram form is shown here. We've got a model which would be tied to the tree near a drongo nest, and then at about 10 to 15 meters away, a small bag hide and video camera in order to observe what's going on. And the models I've got kind of pictures of along the bottom here, but they're incredible. They were made by Rolf Darling, who 3D printed these, so designed a file on a computer and then painted and varnished the plastic to produce these, really quite incredible 3D models of the different birds. So a dove was used as a control to compare responses to what's a non-threat, how do drongos respond to something non-threatening around the nest, and then also using African cuckoo and a little sparrowhawk model. A little bit more, just if you're interested in the process here. So this is a point of view from near to where a model is. And this is just the setup process that I was just describing with the bag hide. So you might see the drongo in the nest just here. And then I'm appearing a little bit later, a little bit further away, and disappearing bit by bit into a bag hide, hopefully to the point where I'm not spotted by any drongos as they then respond to the model. And what we saw was huge amounts of drongo aggression to both the hawk and the cuckoo models. Not surprising probably to any of you that have seen drongos mobbing raptors in the field, and something that we were kind of expecting to differ from the common cuckoo, where it works quite well with reed warblers that are afraid of mobbing a hawk. Drongos appear to be really quite different. Like I mentioned, these are plastic models that have been 3D printed, and the drongo mobbing was so aggressive that it still could break through the plastic at points. I actually had one model that was decapitated by the sheer force of Drongo mobbing. And it would be super common in the field as well to just find cuckoo feathers beneath a Drongo nest. You could often kind of piece together a crime scene by seeing a smashed cuckoo egg below a nest, some cuckoo feathers, and yeah, hints that a cuckoo was there, but definitely seen off by a Drongo. And as you can imagine, superglue became an important part of field kit in order to repair these models and to continue doing different experiments. And what we found in summary was that Drongos were not afraid of mobbing hawks. And instead of treating cuckoos like hawks and being afraid of both of them, they actually mobbed hawks as we were expecting them to mob cuckoos. They treated both cuckoos and hawks as if they were cuckoos and mobbed them really intensely at the start of nesting, when cuckoos are a biggest threat of laying their egg in the nest. And this definitely implies that Drongo aggression undermines the adaptation that African cuckoos presumably historically evolved to protect themselves. So that brings us on to the question of, well, why would a cuckoo choose to parasitize such an aggressive host? We mentioned that they're specialists on the Drongos. Why on earth would they specialize on a bird that's so effective at undermining their hawk mimicry and so aggressive in attacking them? And well, maybe we need to think back to this start. So choosing a host, that very first bit of this arms race, and this trade-off that I mentioned between choosing a high quality host or one which is easy to parasitize. We can definitely see now that the Drongo is not easy to parasitize because of this aggression that it has. But is it a high quality host? Well, one way of looking at that is to look at how well its nest survives. And actually, it looks like Drongo's aggression could be beneficial compared to other species nesting in a similar habitat. This is a photo of a Drongo mobbing a model snake, a rubber snake. And in general, we see that Drongo nests tend to have slightly higher survival compared to other species that have similar types of nests in the same areas, nesting at the same time. So African cuckoos, by specializing on Drongos, might mean that their chicks have a better chance of survival and evading predation, which otherwise is super high. It's kind of in the region of 80 to 90% of nests that get predated. Really interestingly, we don't find that within Drongos. So at the kind of, is it worth choosing Drongos as a species? Potentially, yes. But we didn't find that more aggressive Drongos showed better nest survival than less aggressive Drongos. So at a kind of day-to-day level for the African cuckoo, if they choose a more aggressive Drongo to lay their egg in their nest, they might just get beaten up, but not actually see any benefit later on in terms of chick survival. Okay, so that's a bit of what's going on in this first stages, these frontline defenses and counter adaptations of the arms race between African cuckoos and fork-tailed Drongos. But it's not all over there. We need to move on to the egg stage. Let's suppose we've had a successful parasitism. The cuckoo has got through that Drongo mobbing and defenses and managed to lay its egg in the Drongo nest. If the cuckoo's succeeded with all of that, it's not game over. There's still an opportunity for Drongos to defend their nest now we're at the egg stage. Studying this in Drongos is really quite difficult on account of the fact that Drongos like to build their nests far out on the ends of usually pretty thin branches, often 7 to 15 meters high in trees. We have a pretty high-tech piece of equipment to get around this, the egg spoon, as you can see in this image. So it's kind of a little wire coil on the end of a long stick. And there'll be someone at the end of this long stick actually wielding the egg spoon in this case. And here's the Drongo nest in this picture that this egg has just been scooped out of. The photo on the right is just of the egg spoon in a little bit more detail. You might have noticed that's not a Drongo nest. This is actually a cavity nesting black-collared barbet, but that's a whole other story. We're using these egg spoons to then check the eggs and see what's going on at that stage of this battle between the cuckoos and the Drongos. So the question to start with is, okay, so if we've got these eggs out of the nest, how do we spot a cuckoo egg? And the Hamasakili method developed by Lazaro Hamasakili is that cuckoo eggs tend to have a flatter bottom than the Drongo eggs. So they'll stand up vertically on your palm as opposed to rolling over like the Drongo eggs do. So that's one way. But actually this matters not just for us as researchers trying to work out if a nest has been parasitized, but it also matters hugely for Drongos, because if they're able to work out if there's a cuckoo egg in their nest, then they'll be able to remove that egg before it hatches into a cuckoo chick. And Drongos are actually very, very good at this task. They'll reject a mismatching cuckoo egg very easily and be able to see the odd egg out. It's essentially an odd one out kind of a task. But because Drongos are so good at rejecting odd eggs, over evolutionary time, it seems that cuckoo eggs have become much closer to match Drongo eggs. So this makes it much more of a challenge for the Drongos, because the closer the cuckoo egg matches the Drongos, the more likely it is it'll be accepted. It makes finding the odd one out a much harder task. So what can Drongos do if cuckoos are so good at matching their eggs? Well, the next move seems to be signatures. So even once cuckoo eggs perfectly match Drongos, there's one way that Drongos can continue this defense, and that's by evolving these what we call egg signatures. And signatures have long been used to identify who someone is. What makes a signature? Well, a signature is distinct for an individual. So if you write your own signature, it will be distinct to you and very different from someone else's signature. That means you can recognize it as yours. It'll be repeatable. So every time you do your signature, it'll be more or less the same. And that again means that you're able to identify it and make sure you can recognize it. And it will also probably have some level of complexity. If it was just a line, it would be really easy for anyone to forge your signature. But if it's a little bit more complex than that, that makes it more difficult to forge. And just like human signatures have these features that make them hard to forge and make it easy to identify your own, Drongo eggs have signatures. So let's look at those three things again. Distinct for an individual, repeatable, and complex. Well, here's a range of different Drongo clutches. So these are all Drongo eggs, and each lays a clutch kind of the same, but you can see that they're very different between the different Drongo clutches. So we've got distinct for an individual, because one Drongo individual might have blotchy eggs, another might have these kind of lightly speckled eggs, another might have a different color. They're repeatable, so you can see that within each clutch, the eggs are looking really similar. And again, that makes it more that they can identify their own. And you can also see kind of some complexity. So these different markings, you do also get plain Drongo eggs, but often there's kind of these different markings which add complexity and might make it more difficult for a cuckoo to forge them. Okay, so cuckoos, however, can forge signatures. So even though there's a whole range now, rather than just one type of thing that cuckoos would have to match in order to get away with, we actually see that cuckoos have evolved a range of different patterns and can pretty much cover any different pattern on the egg that any type of Drongo can produce, any fork-tailed Drongo can produce. So all three sets of eggs in this image were found in Drongo nests, and actually in each of them, there's a cuckoo imposter. I don't know if you can guess as you're going along, but if you look at the one on the left, I'll give you a second if you're talking with someone at home. It's actually this egg here on the right. I'll give you a second for the middle one, to which one you think might be the cuckoo. Maybe go back to the Hamasakili method. Can you tell if one's got a slightly flatter bottom? I don't know. It's actually this one again on the right here. And then in that final clutch on the right completely, it's this one here. That's the cuckoo egg. And this is incredible that African cuckoos have almost perfect mimicry of this full range of different Drongo egg patterns. However, each cuckoo can only forge one type of drongo egg. So across different cuckoos, you see the full range of mimicry, but any particular cuckoo can only make one type of forgery, which means if they're laying their eggs across different nests, they have to be really lucky to make sure that their egg matches the particular drongo nest that they've laid their egg in. And you'd think that possibly it would benefit cuckoos if they could have a look first and only lay their eggs if they see a nest has similar eggs to the ones that they have. But we have no evidence of that happening in Choma. And that might be because, firstly, drongos are so aggressive, cuckoos have to be really speedy. They've got to get in and out really quickly laying their egg. Otherwise, they're going to potentially get beaten up. Or it might just be because of that, they also might not even know what their own eggs look like. So instead, what we tend to see is this scattergun approach where cuckoos just lay their eggs at random. But then usually the drongos will reject those non-matching eggs. And it's only where the cuckoo's been really lucky and happened upon an egg where the drongo eggs match their own that the egg has a chance of getting through this line of defense from the drongos. It's not just drongos and cuckoos that have these egg signatures to protect themselves against brood parasites. This beautiful image by Claire is of tawny flanked prunias in that outside ring, and they're parasitized by cuckoo finches on this inside ring. And again, you can see that the prunias and you can see that again the parasite has kind of evolved to match these different colors. Interestingly, unlike the drongo and cuckoo, where the cuckoo seems to have evolved to fully match all the different possible drongo eggs, there's no olive coloured eggs yet, as far as we know, in the cuckoo finches. So that seems to be a signature that's not forgeable yet. And I'd just like to say, yeah, so all this work on the drongos and cuckoos with the egg signatures has been really well unpicked by Jess Lund, who I showed earlier on from the research group. Okay, so if a cuckoo egg has made it through successfully through this stage, which, as you can see, would have been quite a challenge without being spotted or removed by a drongo, or even being eaten by a predator. So predators also are a big challenge at the egg stage. What happens next? Well, at the chick stage, things take a slightly different pace. And honestly, I think this is bizarre. So even though drongos are very, very good at spotting the odd egg out in the nest, even if it's only slightly different, they seem pretty clueless when there's a huge, obviously not drongo chick bursting out of their nest. So that's just a bit of footage from a trail cam at a nest that had been parasitised by an African cuckoo. That just always makes me smile because in the rain, the drongo is trying to shelter this massive chick and clearly struggling. And the cuckoo chick doesn't look too impressed either. Yeah, it's kind of a really strange thing that at the chick stage, the drongos will happily feed the cuckoo. And they actually have this really bright orange gape that again kind of might attract lots of feeding. We're not exactly sure. There's an even stranger thing which happens, which is that as the cuckoo chick fledges, it faces another danger. And what we've seen on multiple occasions actually is that drongos which are happily feeding this cuckoo chick, even though it looks nothing like a drongo chick, happily feeding it, is kind of outside the nest, standing nearby the nest, still being fed, no problem. When the cuckoo chick fledges first from the nest, so when it first flies and leaves the branch, drongos will switch immediately to attacking it and mobbing it, like we saw them mob the adult African cuckoo. And so that's really quite dangerous potentially for the chick at that stage that it's being attacked by its foster parents. And then even more strangely, after the cuckoo chick lands, a little bit later, we'll often see it being fed again by the parents. So there's some kind of strange switch in the Drongo's behaviour that when this chick's stationary or stood, they'll feed it. Then when it flies, they recognise it as some kind of enemy. Now, we don't know if they're recognising it as a cuckoo or if due to this hawk mimicry, they're seeing a hawk. But they'll switch to attacking. And then when it lands, switch back to feeding again. And this is kind of, really strange and something that we're interested to look more at using an elaborate setup of more 3D printed models and a zip line and a remote Bluetooth release. So you can click this Bluetooth thing from a distance and that will release the model from the zip line. And that's kind of plans for future research that's going on. But actually, if any of you have observations of other brood parasite chicks as they're fledging and leaving nests, we'd love to know. So do get in contact with me if you do. It looks like it's definitely something that happens in common cuckoos and also even in honey guides, that you get this switch from feeding to attacking as the chicks fledge and then switching back to feeding. But if you have any other observations, I'd be really interested to hear about them. And that takes us more or less to the end of the cycle. The cuckoo chick fledging, if it survives, subsequent years and its intra-African migration will then become the adult that's laying its egg and parasitizing a whole new load of Drongos in subsequent years for this battle to continue over evolutionary time. So I'd like to say a huge thanks to Claire and to the research group, to everyone that we work with in Zambia and the Department of National Parks and Wildlife and the Cuculus University, and to all of you and to BirdLife South Africa for talk this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was brilliant. That was so interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and all your research. I was very pleased to hear that you had, that Rolf had made your decoys. He actually made decoys for me of African penguins using cement, not 3D printing, but they're amazing. You can probably maybe see in my profile picture with the decoy. So nice little connection there. But thank you so much. That was fascinating. Before we get on to some questions, I just want to let everyone know that the next webinar in 2 weeks' time will be by Trevor Harker, who will be sharing some stories from his Western Cape big year last year. So please do tune in for that in 2 weeks' time. Okay, so there are quite a few questions coming in. I hope you can still hear me okay. I did have some internet issues while you were talking, but hopefully we'll hang on. I am going to be a bit selfish and ask a question that I was wondering about from Henny. Do you know, he asks, is there a way to estimate how many eggs the cuckoo must lay before there is a signature match? Or how many eggs do they lay, in total?
Really good question. So the best we know of how many an African cuckoo lays in one breeding season is actually from older work where cuckoos were shot and the number of eggs in their oviduct is looked at. That's not how things are done anymore, but that was about 20. So it looks like African cuckoos are probably able to lay about 20 eggs in one season. And then actually Jess, who I mentioned, did a lot of this work on signatures, tried to calculate based on how many eggs are rejected. So I think she found it was really high, something around the 90% mark of eggs won't be successful. They'll be laid in nests that don't match their signature. And then if you also look at how high predation is there, so even with a Drongo defending a nest really aggressively, most nests will be predated. It actually looks like over a whole lifetime, an African cuckoo will only have about 2 chicks that will be raised successfully by Drongos. And that's despite laying 20 eggs every season, multiple seasons in a row. So it's really quite low.
Wow, that is incredible. So that kind of links into Eddie's question. So the cuckoo females lay eggs in multiple nests in one season.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, they also seem to have territories. So we tend to find, which we can identify because they have the same kind of egg as well, and also from genetic analyses. But yeah, it seems that a cuckoo will kind of have a region, and within that region, they'll have a good sense of where the different drongos are, and they'll lay multiple eggs within that season. And it's really quite a feat cognitively, because they've got to keep track not only of where drongo nests are, but also the timing. So if an African cuckoo lays its egg too late, then it's not going to be able to hatch in time for that chick to kill the other drongos and to be fed. So it's got a really narrow window of time, and it has to be keeping track of multiple different drongo nests and the timings of those drongo nests. To see.
Wow, yeah, okay. Hard work being a parasite.
Super hard work. Seems like the easy way out, palm off the cost of parenting onto someone else, but
so Rob Simmons asks if the cuckoo does manage to push the eggs of the host out, does the host then remove them from the ground or wherever they've landed, as this may attract predators?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Hard to say for sure. We haven't got observations of the host moving them directly, and we do fairly often, I would say, come across nests where you can see smashed eggshells below. I think that tends to be more often when the drongos have rejected an egg. So yeah, it might be a bit different if it's at the chick stage. The drongo behaviour might be a bit different. But definitely, yeah, you see that kind of clearing behaviour in other species. So I don't know if drongos do that, but it would be really interesting to know.
So then there's a question from Peter Archdale, asking whether African cuckoos only parasitize fork-tailed drongos or other African drongo species like the square-tailed and the glossy-backed and the western.
Yeah, another really great question. As far as we know, it's just the fork-tailed drongo. But again, whether there is that hasn't been studied or hasn't been kind of observed before is possible. But as far as you know, it's just the fork-tailed drongo.
Okay, interesting. Eleanor Mary asks possibly an impossible to answer question, but it's very interesting to think about. Are there any theories as to why cuckoos have become parasites? Because as we mentioned earlier, it seems very hard, and if they only, the net benefit is 2 chicks, is there something in their lifestyle that prevents them from building nests? Why do they not do it themselves?
Yeah, that's another brilliant question. All the questions are amazing. So interestingly, brood parasitism has evolved about 7 times independently across birds. So that's not just cuckoos, that's also things like honey guides and cuckoo finches, and one duck species as well. And the fact that it's happened so many times kind of its own accord does really kind of imply that there's big benefits to being a parasite. And I think what's quite interesting is what we're looking at here with the drongos and African cuckoos is after a long time of the 2 evolving together. So a lot of these drongo defenses that are making it so hard for the cuckoo are probably things that have evolved over time rather than things that were there when parasitism kind of first evolved. So it might have been that initially there was a much bigger payoff to being able to do it. If there were very few defenses and it was possible to lay your eggs and just have them raised by another species, that would have been selected for. And then if over time cuckoos then lost the ability to build their own nests or to parent and raise their own chicks, they're now kind of almost stuck in this dead end where they've got to continue parasitizing. But if you're kind of interested in that, I think Gabriel Jamie also gave a conservation conversations seminar, which will be on YouTube, in which he talks about brood parasitism more in general, and kind of maybe how it evolved across different taxa.
Yeah, he definitely did give a webinar last year or 2021, I think, but it is definitely on YouTube. So that kind of links to a question from Wilfred saying, if the success rate for cuckoos is so low, will they ever evolve back into building their own nests, or as you say, are they kind of stuck in this?
Yeah. A super intriguing question. I'd love to know. I think what you tend to see more commonly is host switching. So if it just gets to a point where the host kind of has won this battle between the two, that might be a point at which a parasite is forced to switch to parasitizing a different host, maybe one with less defenses, or that hasn't yet got defenses. And there's obviously costs that come with that, which is why we don't see it all the time. And it is much more common in some parasitic species than others. So the more generalist ones might be more able, that have multiple hosts anyway, might be quite easy for them to switch. I don't think, as far as we know, we've got any examples of parasites that are kind of like these cuckoos going back to building their own nests. My guess is it would be really difficult for that to evolve back again. But yeah, definitely there's got to be other ways out, because it can look quite negative otherwise.
Then something else that I have been wondering, I have a question from Rob. Does the male cuckoo play any role in supporting the female with locating nests or distracting from defenses, or is it just, they get to mate and move on?
Yeah, no, really good question. So we're not sure for the African cuckoo, but there's definitely evidence in the common cuckoo, and this might be what Rob's alluding to, that the male kind of plays this distracting role. And can be around and kind of draw the attention of the host towards it, and the female can sneak in and lay its egg alongside.
Yeah, because it does seem like the female is taking most of the risks there. Leslie asks, or says, most cuckoos seem to be migratory. Is that because they eat insects, and do the hosts also generally eat insects as well? I guess a lot of birds are insectivorous, but is there any kind of link between the diet that the parents would be feeding the chicks?
Wow. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. So definitely that's true of kind of these Cuculus cuckoos. I think certain other parasites can have other diets. So for example, honey guides, I mentioned really briefly just then, will parasitize, lesser honey guides will parasitize black-collared barbets and other barbets that are actually many fruit feeders. So that, yeah, there's not just a necessarily direct link to make between diet and maybe migration and parasitism. But it's a really interesting observation of those two, kind of seem to crop up together. So maybe that's another area for future research.
And another question from Rob Simmons. Do you know what the difference in breeding success of Drongos versus similar species in similar habitats?
So for this one site in Choma, the Drongo nesting success was around 20%, looking over kind of multiple breeding seasons. And for other open cut species, so I think for dark cut bulbuls, it was around 13%. For brown crowned and black crowned chagras, similar, kind of between the 10 and 15% mark. And yeah, so for platform nesters like ringneck doves, much lower again, around 8%. So it does look like a 20% Drongos are doing quite well, although I would say like only 1 in 5 surviving is still very high predation.
Yeah, definitely, and seems sort of counterintuitive given how aggressive they are.
Yeah.
Okay, so another question from Peter about kind of going more into other parasites. Do the Drongos share any lice parasite species with the African cuckoos? Have some sort of ectoparasites evolved in this little species complex?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I have no idea when it comes to those ectoparasites. Presumably because I think they're often picked up at the nest stage by chicks. So you would probably expect that there's a really strong overlap between those parasites. Yeah, I don't know if that's been looked at all by researchers, but would be really interesting.
I lost the question I was going to ask there. Oh, yes, this one. From Andrew and Ruth. Does a single cuckoo have the ability to change its egg signature to match, if there's a predominant egg signature in the area? And if so, is this learned or evolution?
Yeah, so the question of like how these signatures come about and the kind of biology that means that you end up with these patterns on the eggs is something that Gabriel Jamie in the group's looking into quite a lot now. And it seems like it's pretty much entirely genetically determined. So it's not something that birds can change through their lifetime. It's something that certainly for hosts seems to often be, well, it depends actually. So yeah, hosts tend to inherit genes from both their father and their mother that contribute to the pattern on the egg. But in some parasites, they only inherit genes from the mother so that they can get particular patterns. And that means for parasites which have multiple different hosts, so this doesn't apply to the cuckoos, but it does to cuckoo finches, for example. If they need to make sure that if I'm parasitizing this species, I have this type of egg, the females only pass on that egg pattern, which means you get lines of females within that parasitic species that just pick one host species. But because they mate with many different males, it stays together as one species rather than splitting into different parasitic species, specializing on those different types of hosts. But yeah, essentially, sorry to answer, that went off on a tangent. I do tend to do that. The answer is, yeah, they don't seem to be able to change their egg pattern. Like what they are born with will remain the pattern that they'll lay throughout.
I don't know if the Drongos could manage if they were able to change. Now, a question from Mike Bridgeford. Does the cuckoo chick have any relationship with its real parent? For example, the areas of migration, is that sort of instinctively or genetically coded in, or yeah, do you know if they have any, they share anything like that?
Yeah, so we assume that they don't. As far as we know, there's kind of no contact between that parent and their chick from kind of that point of laying onwards. It's actually especially interesting, I suppose, yeah, as you're saying, in migration, in terms of, that kind of thing is often learned between parent and chick in other species. And it's also really interesting for the honey guides, which I keep mentioning as this other parasite that the research group studies, where because honey guides cooperate with humans to find bees' nests, and that's again a behaviour that has to be learned. And because they're also brood parasites, we don't really understand where they learn this behaviour from, because presumably they can't meet their parents if they're just disconnected from that really early life stage. So it's a really interesting question as to how things like migration routes and particular behaviours are learned socially by these birds once they leave the host nest. So great question, but we don't know the answers yet. We're working on these things.
So two kind of linked questions, or I'm linking them. So one from Stashi, asking about so mentioning mobbing and mimicry and aggression, and whether anyone's kind of looked at any bird sort of psychology around those sorts of issues. And the question that I'm linking that to is from Faisal, saying, does the cuckoo chick know that it's a cuckoo and not a drongo? Sort of getting into the mindset of these birds. Do you know if there's been any research into that?
Yeah, cognition's really hard. You essentially often have to kind of look at behaviours and then test different behaviors and kind of work backwards. Okay, so if they behaved in this way, what does that mean for how they're thinking? But it can be really hard to get at the actual kind of cognition behind something. Definitely with things like the egg patterns, that's slightly different to what's being asked, but there's different rules that birds seem to follow, and ways that they, people are looking at the cognition and the way that they perceive things. You've always got to look from kind of a bird's eye point of view if you're wanting to understand the different adaptations going on. But sorry, the question you were linking that to, I did have something to say. I've just forgotten what it was.
How does the cuckoo know it's a cuckoo if it's been raised by Drongos?
Yeah, really good question. So again, a lot of birds, as you'll probably know, will learn things like song in the nest. But there must just be kind of a bigger genetic component rather than a kind of learning component to how that works for the cuckoo. Otherwise, it would be busy singing Drongo songs and not attracting any cuckoos later in life to make them.
Question from Eddie. Does the female cuckoo mate with multiple males, or do they form pairs, monogamous pairs?
Yeah, so this is also really interesting because it's kind of generally expected that one of the reasons that quite a lot of birds that build their own nests are kind of socially monogamous or kind of stay in their pair bonds is because they're needing to do this parenting together. So because you don't have that need in these cuckoos, there's kind of a prediction that you would expect much more mating with different males or different individuals rather than any kind of pairing. But across quite a lot of parasites, weirdly, we do see pairing. We see quite high kind of partner fidelity over time. And we're not quite sure why that is or what benefits that has. But interestingly, there seems to be a trend that we see.
Interesting. Another question from Rob is asking or saying, one would assume an older parasite would lay more eggs and also choose both the aggressive and the less aggressive Drongos as opposed to hedging the bets, I guess. Do you see that in your studies?
Yeah, I've been finding the optimal kind of strategy is really interesting. I think interestingly this idea of choice, because of how speedy the African cuckoos have to be, and because they're almost limited to these territories which they kind of lay all their eggs in, you do see, well, I suppose, I don't know if it is both bed hatching because they're going to kind of multiple different Drongos and as many nests as possible, but it also is kind of just maximum number of options. Essentially, I think what I'm saying is yes, bed hedging is something we see, but just in terms of cuckoos trying to do everything possible to lay their eggs. Because like I said, they have to be super speedy, so the eggs often kind of already down the oviduct when they're going in to parasitize, so they might not have much of a choice to lay an egg or not once they get to a nest.
It's kind of once they've identified one and they're able to get in, they just go ahead, and it's a case of what they can get rather than specific choice between two different Drongo nests, perhaps.
Exactly, rather than having to choose between this aggressive one and this less aggressive one. Although that choice might happen on the level of, well, I'm not able to get past this Drongo, so that kind of makes the choice for it.
And Emmanuel asks whether Drongo egg patterns vary geographically, because you showed quite a nice example of how it varies individually, but are they grouped geographically or is it kind of random? And go ahead, and there's a follow-up, but I'll let you answer that one.
I mean, we mainly have only studied this intensely in Choma, so I don't know if there's kind of different patterns that aren't present in Choma at all that are present in other regions of the Drongo range. That would be really interesting, because there could be subpopulations that are evolving at different rates and have evolved in different ways. But definitely you see a kind of huge range on a really small scale. So just in a couple of kind of kilometers square radius, you'll see this, the kind of range that I was showing on those slides happens, in a really small area. Whether over a larger area you see even more variation would be really interesting. But I think, as far as I know, in terms of recorded eggs from other places and things like birds of the world, the range that we see in Choma is representative of the range across Drongos, which again doesn't mean there's some that have gone unnoticed, but that seems to be most of the diversity.
So the follow-up question on that, which perhaps doesn't apply if the egg patterns don't vary geographical, if they're kind of spread broadly, is do the cuckoo chicks come back to where they've fledged, or do they go somewhere further afield?
I would love to know that. So essentially we have no idea in terms of we haven't been able to track cuckoos so far, and the only study that I mentioned again quite near the start that has tracked adult cuckoos, I think managed to track 3. They found it just really hard to catch adults and put these little GPS trackers on them. So we don't know if cuckoos return, and this kind of ties into answering those questions that were also brought up about, how do they know where they're going and which migration route to take? Do they, go with their parents? All those kind of questions would be really interesting to look into, but logistically quite difficult with GPS tracking and what we're able to do.
Yeah, sure. There's so many interesting questions. I think we could talk to you all night, but I think we'll start to wrap this up. And there are still quite a few questions in the Q&A box, and I'm sorry to everyone who's asked, but I don't think we can get through them all. Perhaps you would be okay with answering some of them on email if you have time.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think I'll end off with a question from Vicente asking about would you expect the endangered status of parasites is linked closely to the conservation status, and perhaps going in more specifically, what is the conservation status of these 2 species?
Yeah, really great question. So definitely you expect the 2 to be really closely linked, particularly with a specialist parasite like the African cuckoo, where it's entirely reliant on the fork-tailed Drongos. In good news, Drongos are not endangered, they're not threatened. And so the same actually for the African cuckoo. But it's really interesting, these dynamics in general, this breed parasitism for conservation, particularly because, so with honey guides that parasitize the black-collared barbets, they're not actually specialists, they're more generalists, and also parasitize Zambian barbets, which are on the red list actually. And because they're able to keep the numbers of honey guides up from the black-collared barbets, this actually means that they could drive the Zambian barbet numbers really low through parasitism in a way that you wouldn't see in the specialism, because if fork-tailed Drongo numbers were dropping due to African cuckoos, then the African cuckoos numbers would drop, and that would help the Drongos. So there'd only be the problem for both if the Drongos were going down for a different reason. But definitely a really interesting dynamic in the context of conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we'll leave it there. Apologies to everyone who asked questions that we didn't get to. But yeah, hopefully Mairenn can answer some of those, at least on email. I'll send them to you tomorrow morning. But I think we'll leave it there. As I say, we could talk to you all night, I think, and probably have a whole other webinar on this. It's such a fascinating field of work. So thank you so much for your amazing presentation. It was very clear and presented well. So thank you very, very much. Before we close off, do you have any last words you'd like to say?
Oh, just that it's been an absolute pleasure, and I've been amazed by the questions. They've really got me thinking, and yeah, just been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, they have been very insightful, thought-provoking questions. So thank you very much to everyone who asked. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. And Mairenn, thank you very much for the amazing presentation. And please do join us again in 2 weeks' time for our next conservation conversations. Thank you very much. Good night.